Thank you for taking a look at this presentation called Understanding and Managing PTSD. My name is Dr. Miriam Grover, and I am a Principal Cognitive Psychotherapist for the City and Hackney Specialist Psychotherapy Service. These materials are part of a group intervention that was developed by the service and has been run in the service for several years. For each slide in the presentation, I will say a little more about the information and explain some of the questions and reflections that have been made during the group sessions. I hope that you find this presentation informative and helpful. So, what will we be doing in this presentation? Well, one of the aims of this presentation is to help you to understand more about what post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD as I will call it from now on, actually is, and to think about how PTSD affects people and how it affects you. Another aim is to help people to develop a wider range of skills to manage the three key symptom areas of PTSD. These are 1. Mental intrusions, 2. Anxiety and hypervigilance, and 3. Avoidance and numbing. For each of the topic areas in this presentation, you will be encouraged to reflect on the ideas and to think about how you might be able to use them to help you to manage your PTSD symptoms differently. In order to understand how PTSD develops, it's important to have a little bit of knowledge about how memory works. There are two areas of our brains that work together to help us to remember things. One is a part of the brain called the amygdala, and it can be useful to think of this a little bit like a camera that can take snapshots of our experience, the sights, the sounds, the feelings, the smells, etc. The other part of our brains that's very important is called the hippocampus, which is like a photo album. When we're experiencing pleasant, neutral, or even somewhat upsetting events, the hippocampus takes the snapshots taken by our amygdala and stores them away in order into our memory. And, just like a photo album, when you want to or when you need to, you can go back in your memory to that photo album to remember the event. Now, it's important to remember that this is what happens when we are experiencing a pleasant, neutral, or somewhat upsetting event. However, when we are in a very heightened state of emotion, such as during a traumatic event, things change. So what happens during a highly emotional event, such as a traumatic event? Well, your brain goes into a state of alert. The blood flow to your amygdala increases a lot. This is to help your brain to be aware of all the signs of danger. Your amygdala takes many pictures of what you see, what you hear, what you feel, what you smell, etc., as these are all needed by your brain to help you to survive that situation. At the same time, the blood flow to the hippocampus, your memory's photo album, decreases, and so it stops working in the way it usually does. So all of those snapshots that your amygdala is taking aren't stored in order because the part of your brain that does that isn't doing its job. So you end up with a whole pile of snapshots of sights, sounds, feelings, smells, etc. that can't be put away in order, and so they float around unprocessed. A question that you might ask is, what causes my brain to do this? Well, this isn't a conscious or deliberate action on our part. The threat detecting systems in our brain cause this to happen, and it is automatically activated as a protective mechanism. I'd like to use this diagram to describe what happens. Many people have heard of the flight or fight response, but actually what happens is a bit more detailed than they realise. This is important for reasons I'll explain as we go along. To illustrate what I'm saying, I'll use the example of a mouse in a field. Let's say this mouse is in a field nibbling grass or doing whatever mice do, and it hears a twig snap. Its brain will hear that and activate the first stage of the defense cascade, which is to freeze completely still, look, listen, smell, etc., for more information. Although it's completely still, it's absolutely tuned to the environment and what's happening. It's trying to work out if that sound was just a random noise or an indication that danger is around, such as a cat. If there are more signs of danger, then the mouse's brain will send messages to the rest of the brain in the body to take action to try to protect itself. Understandably, the best thing the mouse can do in terms of survival is run away. Point 2 on the diagram. So the mouse's body is flooding with adrenaline and other hormones to help it to act quickly. It starts breathing very quickly to get more oxygen into the blood. Its heart starts pounding to make the blood rush to its muscles, and various other changes happen to enable the mouse to try to run away. However, the mouse might not be able to run away, and it may be trapped somewhere, and so it has to fight. The mouse doesn't actively say to itself, "Well, mouse, you can't run away from this cat, so you've got to fight it." It's an automatic chain of reactions that this part of your brain decides in a fraction of a second. So the mouse may need to fight the cat. This is a less attractive option than running away because the mouse could get hurt by fighting the cat, which is why it's stage 3 in the diagram. This is often as far as a lot of people understand in terms of what happens in these situations. But actually, there's more that can happen. The mouse's brain may detect that it isn't possible to run away or fight the cat with any likelihood of success, and so something else happens. If the threat is inescapable, it goes into fright mode, point 4 on the diagram. This is where the mouse is frozen to the spot and literally can't move. This is very different from stage 1, where the mouse is voluntarily keeping still while assessing the situation. It's at the point of fright that the brain, again, not the conscious brain, but our automatic survival instinct part of our brain, might flip the switch and decide that this situation might be better survived by shutting down. This is called the flag response, number 5 on your diagram. What happens here is that the mouse's nervous system starts to operate in a completely opposite way. Breathing and heart rate slow down. Blood pressure lowers, and the mouse becomes much less psychologically aware of what's happening. Therefore, if the mouse is injured, then it has a better chance of survival. It's also going to remember much less about what happened. This could even be to the degree that the mouse faints. You may have heard the expression playing possum, which means playing dead. There are lots of animals, such as opossums, that when they feel under threat, go straight into the flag response as a protective mechanism. I think it's really important that people understand all stages of this process. As a clinician, I've met many people who have been in a traumatic situation and very quickly found themselves in a fight or a flag state. And because they didn't understand that there is much more to this than just flight or fight, they started to make negative judgments about themselves and the fact that they were not able to run away, fight, or call for help. Remember, the decisions about how to react in traumatic situations is made in our brain's survival systems and not in our conscious thinking parts of our brains. After situations like this, our mouse example will return to its normal functioning after this has happened relatively quickly, whereas humans have much more difficulty in doing so for a number of different reasons. So the next question that you might ask is, does everyone get PTSD after a traumatic incident then? And the answer to that is no, not everyone. But anyone can develop PTSD. We're used to hearing in the media about people working in the armed forces, such as in the army, getting PTSD. And people in our clinic have often told me that they thought it was only people in those kinds of jobs that could get PTSD. Now, this isn't true at all. Anyone who's exposed to a traumatic event could develop PTSD, but not everybody does. Straight after a traumatic event occurs, the symptoms that I'm going to talk about more in the following slides are common and to be expected in the early days after the event happens. It's normal to experience some or all of them. However, over a period of a few weeks, often those symptoms will reduce and go away. PTSD is diagnosed if those symptoms don't go away after a period of time. So what are the symptoms of PTSD? Well, one of the symptoms are mental intrusions. Because the memory cannot be put in order and processed, images and memories of what happened may pop up in your mind even when you don't want them to. These are called mental intrusions. It may also feel like the event is happening again, and these are called flashbacks. And these often happen when something triggers them. You may not even be aware of what it is that has triggered these from happening, as often these triggers can be very subtle. This can happen during the daytime or at night when you're sleeping, and people often report that they have bad dreams and nightmares that are somewhat related to the traumatic events that they've been through. Mental intrusions and flashbacks are very upsetting and can be very frightening for people. But it is important for you to know that they will not harm or damage your brain. Another group of symptoms related to PTSD are the psychological and emotional responses that people notice. You may find that you feel very anxious a lot of the time, and you're often very jumpy, as if you're sitting on the edge of your seat. You may experience outbursts of anger, things making you anger very quickly where they might not have done before. You might find it hard to concentrate on things, that your mind wanders continuously, or it's hard to focus. You may find that you feel so on edge that it's hard for you to relax and to fall asleep. And perhaps you've noticed that you tend to be on the lookout for possible trouble coming, almost as if you're constantly looking over your shoulder. This is known as hypervigilance. Another key symptom of PTSD is avoidance and numbing. Understandably, people don't like having mental intrusions and flashbacks, and they don't like feeling anxious and under threat. As a result, they try to find ways to stop this from happening. So we might try to avoid reminders of what happened, as these can be triggers for our symptoms. We might try very hard not to think about what happened. We might try to shut off from our feelings. We might try to avoid places or people that have some connection or reminder of what happened. Often this can be very difficult to achieve, and we still get the symptoms anyway. Or we may find that we are losing interest in life and feel apart from or not connected with others. We notice that our feelings aren't the same as they were before the event, and we can lose our sense of the future. In order to feel more in control of your emotions, your daily life and your experience, it is important to develop a skill set in order to help you to stay within the warm zone, or, as some clinicians will call it, within the window of tolerance. If your emotions are too cold, then it is likely that you are to some degree dissociated. Dissociated means that you feel disconnected from your senses or emotions, your sense of self, your personal history, or that the world doesn't feel quite real. There are degrees of this, from the very brief experiences which all of us have from time to time, to the more problematic experiences where this is more prolonged, which is common when people have experienced a trauma. There's also variation in the severity of this. This is shown as stage 5, the flag stage, on the diagram on slide number 8. You will also need to learn how to cool down your emotions if they become too hot and you become highly distressed by flashbacks and mental intrusions. This is shown as stage 2 and 3, the flight and fight stage on the diagram on slide number 8. By learning how to reduce your distress when it is running high and how to re-establish connection with your emotions, your sense of self and the world when your experience is too cold, will help you to feel more in control of your daily life and experience. It would also help you to be in a good position later on to be able to engage in a trauma-focused or trauma-informed treatment if you and your assessing clinician feel that this is the most appropriate step for you. One of the first things that you can do to help to manage your PTSD symptoms is to understand more about them. We suggest that you spend some time keeping a diary of them. We understand that this can be difficult because we all know that one of the key symptoms of PTSD is the drive to avoid reminders, and that's how people can get stuck with their symptoms. However, keeping a diary of what's happening to you can help you to start to understand more about the patterns of your symptoms. It can often be difficult to see any patterns in what's happening and what is causing this. However, by keeping a diary, this can help these things to become much clearer for you. When things become clearer, they can become more manageable and more predictable. Start by noting down the day and time when you had the symptom. Also, have a think about what you were doing or what was going on around you. Over time, this information will help you to develop more understanding about what triggers your symptoms. Then have a think about the type of symptom. Was it a flashback, as if the event were happening again, or a mental intrusion that came into your mind when you didn't want it to? Or did you notice that you were shut down? Then try to briefly describe this. People often find that their mental intrusions and flashbacks tend to be about particular aspects of their traumatic experiences rather than just random. Again, this is useful information for you to know and understand now and in terms of your future treatment that you might have. It's useful to have an estimation of how long this symptom lasted, as this will help you to see possible improvements when you develop skills to manage the symptoms more effectively. And lastly, keep a note of what did and didn't help you after you had the symptoms. Everybody is different, and what helps one person may not necessarily help another, so try to keep your diary and your symptom management plan as personally relevant as possible. It's important to keep recording these regularly and as soon as possible after they happen. We recommend that you review these sheets on a regular basis to see whether you can start to identify any patterns emerging. Welcome to topic 2. In this topic, we'll be discussing a skill called grounding. Grounding is the name given to different techniques that all have the same aim in helping you to be present in your body in the here and now. These techniques can be equally as useful when you are having flashbacks and losing contact with the here and now, and also when you are becoming dissociated. There are many different ways of grounding, and we will introduce you to some of them here. Some work better for some people than for others, and some work better in different situations. The aim of this topic is to help you to explore different ways of grounding and to find as many different types of grounding techniques as you can that you can apply in many different situations. Grounding techniques need to be simple enough for you to use when you notice that you are becoming distressed or dissociated, so that you can use them as soon as possible. Like any new skill, it's important to be patient with yourself and give yourself time to practice them. Also, as with any other skill, the more you practice them, the better and more helpful they become. We will be talking about grounding using our 5 different senses, starting with sight. There are many different ways to ground using sight, and just a few are mentioned here. If you find yourself losing contact with the here and now, you can look around where you are and identify 3 things you hadn't noticed before. You can name them aloud in your head. Perhaps you can take this a little further and look for 3 things that are a particular colour, for example, the colour green. Another thing you can do is to blink your eyes repeatedly and focus on the feeling of doing this. You may want to carry around a picture of something that represents your life as it is right now and look at that and describe it to yourself. You might come up with some ideas yourself. Remember, the aim is to use sight to orientate yourself back to the here and now. Using taste for grounding. There are different ways of using taste for grounding. You could eat something delicious and focus on the taste and the texture of this. Alternatively, you can eat something with a very strong flavour, such as lemons or lozenges like Fisherman's Friend. The taste doesn't have to be pleasant or something that you like particularly, just strong enough to bring you back to your body in the here and now. Alternatively, you may find it useful to try eating small amounts of ice or to drink very cold water. Using smell for grounding. Smell is one of the senses that can have very strong associations for us. You may want to use smell for grounding with some caution, although it can be a very effective method of grounding. You may remember how in old movies people would often call for something called smelling salts when people became overwhelmed. If you are going to use smell for grounding, then it's important that you do not use anything that is linked to your trauma, even if it was a smell that you used to like. Remember that the intention of grounding is to bring you to the here and now. You might want to use a smell that's comforting and pleasant to you, or simply a smell that is strong and that quickly brings you back to the present. People often use things like essential oils, spices, or perfume for this. Using your sense of touch for grounding. You can touch an object where you are, such as the feel of a seat that you are sitting on. You can focus on the sensation of running your fingers across the fabric, the wood, or the metal of the seat. You can focus on the sensation of sitting on the seat and the contact the seat has with your body. You can touch a wall and note the sensation of it, for example, whether it is rough or smooth, and the temperature of the wall. You can focus on the sensation of your feet on the floor. Notice where your feet, and perhaps your toes, are in contact with your socks, your shoes, or perhaps directly on the floor. You may want to change position completely to the position that you were in when you started to notice your distress increasing or yourself dissociating. You may want to carry a grounding object around in your pocket. This is an object that helps to keep you in touch with the here and now. In our clinic, when we run this intervention as a group, we offer the people attending the option to take some stones from a container that we keep especially for the group. People can choose a rough or a smooth stone and use this as a grounding object with the symbolism that it represents their first steps in overcoming PTSD. Have a think about how you might use touch to help with your grounding. The last sense that we're going to discuss in terms of grounding is the sense of hearing. If you notice that you're becoming very distressed or feeling cut off, then try listening to the sounds in your environment. Name them aloud in your head. Perhaps you'll be able to make a comment about them to yourself, such as whether you've noticed them before, or whether those sounds are loud or soft. Alternatively, you can listen to music that relaxes you, or perhaps music that has very recently been released. You can talk aloud to yourself. Remind yourself of where you are, what the day is, what the date is, and remind yourself that you are safe now. Perhaps you can say positive comments about yourself aloud. What we would like you to do now is to develop your own list of helpful grounding skills. We'd like you to try some of the grounding skills that you've learnt about in this topic, or perhaps some that you've thought of yourself or have been mentioned to you by other people. We'd like you to experiment with them and find out which grounding skills work for you at different times and in different places. We'd like you to keep a list of how well these work for you and score them out of 10 for their helpfulness. Remember that you are learning new skills and these need practice. There are many things that we often do during the day without realizing that this can interfere with our ability to get a good night's sleep. Napping during the day can prevent us from feeling tired when it comes to bedtime. If you absolutely feel like you must have a nap, try to limit this to under 30 minutes. Caffeine and nicotine are both stimulants and so prevent us from relaxing. Drinking caffeinated drinks such as tea, coffee and hot chocolate can actually perk us up rather than making us feel tired. The same is true for cigarettes. Many people say that an alcoholic drink helps them to sleep. Whilst this may help some people fall asleep, alcohol actually increases your chances of waking up in the night a couple of hours later. Heavy meals before bedtime require a lot of digestion, and this may interfere with our sleep. If you use screens, such as tablets and mobile phones before bed, in the settings, change the lighting setting so that your screens are not using the usual blue light setting. This default setting has a similar effect to the light of the sun, and your brain will interpret it as sunlight and make you less inclined to want to sleep. So, in the afternoon or the evening, change your settings to a softer light setting. Avoid exciting television, movies or books before you go to bed. Opt for something more relaxing instead. And try not to have difficult or highly emotional conversations with people before going to bed, as this will make you more inclined to reflect on them when you lie down to sleep. Managing the effects of nightmares. Many people with PTSD experience nightmares on a regular basis. If this happens to you, then it can be useful to anticipate that this might happen and prepare your environment to help you when it does happen. It can be useful to have a nightlight near your bed, but not candles. A gentle light can help to reorientate you to the here and now when you wake up. If you find smell a useful means of grounding, then have some essential oils or other grounding smells close to your bedside and within reach. The same goes for any grounding pictures or objects that you find helpful. Some people find it helpful to get out of bed for a short while after waking up from a nightmare. You may need to wrap yourself up in some clothing that is warm and comforting. Splashing your face with cool water can help with grounding. You may want to have a warm decaffeinated drink such as herbal tea and to sit somewhere calm while you drink it. It may even be useful to leave a fresh tea bag in a cup and to fill the kettle before going to bed so that it's easier to make your drink if you're feeling distressed. Slowly and calmly say your name to yourself out loud. Say where you are. Remind yourself of the day or the date if you're able to, and tell yourself that you are safe. You may find it helpful to look around the room and identify familiar objects. Say their names out loud to yourself. This will help to orientate you to the here and now. You may find it useful to try the other grounding techniques that you have learned and are helpful to you. Finally, return to bed when you feel able to do so. One way of understanding how avoidance affects people with PTSD is by us using an example. We're going to use the example of a lady called Jay. Jay was a front seat passenger in a car accident. The accident happened late at night after she'd had a few drinks with a friend and decided to get a taxi home. Jay was injured in the accident and broke her arm. She's a musician, and she was worried that she might not be able to play the piano again due to the injury. She also thought that perhaps the accident might not have happened if she hadn't had those drinks and had driven herself home. So let's think about what are the sorts of things that Jay might want to avoid after having had that accident. After that accident, Jay might avoid going out in the evenings, for example, because that's when the accident happened. She might avoid taking taxis because the accident happened when she was in a taxi, or perhaps travelling by car at all, particularly at night when the accident happened. Jay might avoid being driven by anyone else and only agree to get into a car if she can be the driver. Jay might avoid going out to see her friends, particularly if she might be drinking alcohol. She might also avoid playing the piano or putting any stress on her arm because of her fears of the outcome of the accident. Another aspect of PTSD treatment is addressing avoidance. In order to recover from trauma and to get your life back, it is important to face these fears rather than avoid them. It's important to stress, however, that this needs to be done through gradually approaching these situations. Now, where you're at in terms of your recovery from PTSD may mean that this does not feel possible at the moment, and that's fine. Or you may feel able to make some very small steps. If you want to think about this and not necessarily take any action at this point in time, what you might want to do is to imagine or to draw a ladder. On each rung of the ladder, place a situation that you fear, with the one that you fear the least on the bottom rung of the ladder, and the one that you fear the most at the top. Creating our ladder of avoidance. Remember, when we're thinking about working on our avoidance, it's important that we first create a ladder of our avoidance from the least difficult situation on the bottom rung right up to the most difficult situation on the top rung. Then, for each rung on the ladder, we break down that area of avoidance into very small and very manageable steps starting with the least difficult one. For example, I might be avoiding going on a bus. My first step will not be forcing myself to get on the first bus I see. I will break this down for myself into much smaller steps. My first step might be looking out of my window at a bus stop. It might take me some time while I do this for my anxiety to reduce, and I might have to repeat this many times until I feel comfortable enough with this in order to move on to the next step. My next step might then be going out of my home into the street and looking at the bus stop from there. Again, I might need to give myself a lot of time and to repeat this many times until I feel comfortable to move on to the next step, which might be standing at the bus stop for a while. And so the process continues. If you don't feel able to make any changes at present, that's fine. How about thinking about the things that you're avoiding and making a ladder of those from the least feared to the most feared in preparation for your future treatment?